Whoever has studied Jung will surely have heard of the trickster figure. In recent years, its apparent intrapsychic role as the precursor to the saviour has dominated online pop discourse on the subject, through out-of-context dissemination of Jung's ideas from various pop psychologists and internet gurus. The general conception online is that the trickster is a part of the collective unconscious, residing deep within the shadow, playing tricks on the ego through jokes and deceit in an attempt to bring about consciousness, all whilst laced with a hint of paradoxical malevolence. Jung's original writings on the trickster figure are very typical Jung. That is, infused with and filtered through his own personal myth. Tales of history and mythology abound, with little practical utility for the individual in which this so-called archetype manifests. As an example, let's take a quick look at Collected Works 9, Volume 1. The naive reader may imagine that when the dark aspects disappear, they are no longer there in reality. But that is not the case at all, as experience shows. What actually happens is that the conscious mind is then able to free itself from the fascination of evil and is no longer obliged to live it compulsively. The darkness and the evil have not gone up in smoke. They have merely withdrawn into the unconscious, owing to loss of energy, where they remain unconscious so long as all is well with the conscious. But if the conscious should find itself in a critical or doubtful situation, then it soon becomes apparent that the shadow has not dissolved into nothing, but is only waiting for a favourable opportunity to reappear as a projection upon one's neighbour. If this trick is successful, there is immediately created between them that world of primordial darkness, where everything that is characteristic of the trickster can happen, even on the highest plane of civilization. The so-called civilized man has forgotten the trickster. He remembers him only figuratively and metaphorically, when, irritated by his own ineptitude, he speaks of fate playing tricks on him, or of things being bewitched. He never suspects that his own hidden and apparently harmless shadow has qualities whose dangerousness exceeds his wildest dreams. As soon as people get together in masses and submerge the individual, the shadow is mobilized, and, as history shows, may even be personified and incarnated. Reading this, one might well assume that, within themselves, there lurks a, quote, dangerousness that exceeds his wildest dreams, which, whenever they are stressed to some unknown magnitude, quote, the world of primordial darkness is constellated. Somehow this relates to a mythological trickster figure, reified implicitly as a character from mythology. Indeed, believing otherwise is apparently, quote, naive. All poetic distraction from therapeutic intent aside, this is a very suggestive set of ideas, which, once internalized and the collected works closed, instantly loses all context and starts becoming a neurosis that is either felt and held by the individual or managed internally via inflation and projection onto others, as is typical in the manifest behaviour of some pop psychologists and internet gurus. The problem of evil was very important, apparently so, for Jung's own personal myth, but it is not what presents in the average man or woman trying to overcome their own complexes and live their own lives of instinctual fulfillment aligned with their genomic intent. Ideas of good and evil, however, are things which complexes often find most agreeable for their function. It is there where the true trickster function, as described in Psychosystems analysis, truly begins to manifest, in the real shadow of, for example, why one may become entranced by Jung's concept of the shadow in the first place. In this video, you will hear several narrations from the writings of Steve Richards to members of our Jung To Live By Discord community on the real, practical nature of the trickster function. Steve and Pauline Richards are the founders of the Institute for Psychosystems Analysis, who were personally supported by Franz Jung, Carl Jung's only son, to bring his father's work, Carl Jung's work, into the reach of ordinary people. The key phrase here is ordinary, real men and women living their own personal myths. Fascination with abstracted primordial darkness is not individuation. In fact, it is quite the opposite. Being mesmerized with the concept of the shadow is a shadow all of its own, a displacement in the place of active engagement in the world. That is just such a situation in which the trickster will find thoughts for an underused mind to think. To abstract, mythologize, and become engendered with distractionary, illegitimate guilt about moral philosophy completely avoids the real question being posed to the ego by the trickster. That is where the real danger, with etiology in suggestion, taken hold of by a complex, rather than something innate within the genome, innate within oneself, comes to pass. Before we get started with the narrations, let us first take a broad overview of what the trickster function is. On screen is a diagram created by Steve and Pauline Richards, showing the ontology of the trickster function in a simple, linear format. When genomic homeostatic intent is deviated from, the trickster function undergoes a series of ontological changes in expression in an escalating attempt to communicate a balance to the ego. It begins as a psychopomp, but if this is ignored, that is, its message is not made conscious, then it will manifest into a polarized trickster. This is the usual trickster stage spoken of, where the individual in this state believes themselves to be completely in control of their intellect and wit, when, really, parapraxis, hurtful jokes, and suboptimal behaviours all arise among many potential others and make themselves known, causing mischief along the way. As this video will explore, the trickster function is Janus-faced. On one hand, it can be considered positive, insofar as the message it communicates is aligned with adaptation. However, its results, especially if left over time, can cause significant distress to the person in question and others around them. If unconsciousness of the intent remains, then synchronicities constellate as a prodromal signal of the last stage, exteriorization phenomena, or so-called poltergeist phenomena. We have a video on this Jung To Live By channel called Jungian Trickster Poltergeist Caught on Film, in which what appeared to be a classic poltergeist phenomena, someone or something smacking hard on my office door, made itself known during the taping of an IPSA seminar. This video is recommended viewing for further study of the trickster function, as Steve explains precisely what the poltergeist is psychodynamically and how one should go about modelling it. Of note, nowhere along the way of the ontology of the trickster function is any sense of innate evil mentioned. A systems modelling approach, within the framework of adaptation and lifespan development, avoids such reductions, allowing someone to clear their mind of suggestion and influence instead of allowing their complexes to obscure the true intentionality behind any specific manifestation of the trickster. Thus, on this note, let us begin with the narrations. A question is asked. Can a complex hide in humour, playing the comedian, always joking around, as a safeguard against relating? Steve replies, the trickster function, as I refer to it, is, to quote an old saying about fire, a good slave, but a poor master. Complexes can originate in semi-conscious alliance with ego requirements of psychosocial adaptation, sometimes fully consciously. But humour, once it starts to serve itself instead of its host, the ego persona, soon turns on its originator. It is then that a compensatory battle begins, homeostatically, as the unconscious pushes hard to adjust for the overcompensations of the complex, which are inflationary. The ego feels the fear of an imminent loss of libido to the unconscious as depression, and resists. The complex is then invested by energy trying to balance it, which morphs the complex into a trickster. This function is to contain the quote-unquote opposites of ego inflation and unconscious regulatory deflation. In other words, the trickster attempts to carry the polarity within itself as a containing vessel. Trouble is, it's Janus-faced and can act to lead the ego into a disaster through the ego's, misunderstanding of the external world, or an inrush of energy away from outer relating into neurotic fictions. In effect, the trickster carries the split dynamically and seeks to force the ego to resolve the polarity. I have seen so many people think they are in charge of their intelligence, acerbic wit and humour, only to see them beguiled by their inflation into a stalling disaster that could have been avoided. The trickster is both more dangerous and more helpful than any Jungian shadow. It's the process dynamic of homeostasis in psychological form, which is quite happy to mess up your entire life biopsychosocially, if it takes that to bring hubris to an end. Another question is asked. What do you think are the primary contradictions in people where the trickster acts out? Steve replies, in everyday, ordinary circumstances, it is substantial instinctive pressure that passes through the alter ego and moral complex in the form of a trickster. And so, bypasses them. It's a direct, unconscious compensation. In psychopaths, you get a malevolence attached to trickster behaviour, which is not the real trickster, but a learned facsimile of it by observation of its effect. With quote-unquote paranormal trickster activity, which starts with ramped up synchronicities as warning tremors, it is direct from the genomic self as the agent of its pressure to resolve the repressed conflict in the interests of individuation. Further conversation within the server is then had before Steve comes back with exteriorization of trickster phenomenon are a field phenomenon that links several people together. It is an informational field. Action towards it about the trickster, even apparently indirectly, is picked up by the field and transmitted. Me writing here is such a communication, and there will be a resultant effect. It reacts to me in relation to its focus in the person of the individual around whom the phenomena mainly, but are no longer limited to, occur. Someone then asked a question on these previous two posts. So, if the trickster is a containing vessel for unconscious conflict, in order to slingshot the alter ego and moral complex for external resolution, is there a reason why people appear within the same field phenomenon? Steve then replies, yes, they're often either part of the problem in some way, or more often being invited to participate in the solution. The psyche recognizes people who can help in whatever way, ranging from physical support through to a certain sympathetic resonance, in like fashion to how a complex may recognize a therapist from within the unconscious mind of a patient who meets the therapist for the first time. Someone else asks a question. So, can we say that the trickster can't be understood as a collective function, but rather a personal function, with each person having his or her own personal trickster function created by their personal experiences and personal myth? Steve then replies, it is both collective and individual, as in any psychodynamic. We share all of them. It operates individually and collectively according to resolution of immediate action and subsequent effect. Hence, it gets labelled as an archetype. A systems model far better explains the transduction between individual and collective, and back again. Groups need regulating too. Hence they have the capacity to express a collective trickster. The group, as a culture, then mythologizes the regulatory dynamic and action as it seems to be outside of any individual, and therefore like a god or a demon. Anything outside of the ego may be encountered as such, as a group's psychology is every bit as much outside of an individual's self-referent ego identity as its own unconscious is. Hence, both the unconscious and social dynamics become archetypes to the limited bandwidth of a non-inflated ego identification with the unconscious or with social dynamics inflates. Hence, the trickster functions firstly to restore individual balance before it takes more drastic action. The following post was used as a dialectical prompt for members of the Discord server and students at IPSA to join in with. The trickster always betrays its host. It functions as an extension of psychological and psychosocial homeostasis, and under usual self-regulatory conditions is a helpful dynamic within the psyche. Where inflation occurs, however, it will act as transparent self-deception and delusion in bringing about a necessary external regulation to the inflated ego, self-concept. This inflation includes, of course, the persona as the specialized interface between self and others. A fashioned persona in an inflated individual becomes self-deceptive and reinforcing. Reflexivity is lost, and the individual really believes that they are fooling people around them. In many cases, this is true, and yet the trickster dynamic is seeking out a situation, group, or individual that will see through the overcompensated persona and inflating self-concept, down to the Adlerian and or Freudian issues beneath, and then be drawn into the necessity to deflate the individual. Ideally, this is safely. It depends on the context and the extent of the inflation. It, the trickster, can go as far as a sudden catastrophic deflation if the alternative is progression into a Jungian-style latent psychosis. The trickster-controlled individual always believes themselves to be smarter, faster, quicker than anyone else. Inappropriate pre-conscious identification with Hermes and Mercury are the classical analogues. Where character is an issue, those tending towards psychopathy, sociopathy, and narcissism will use charm and social deception, but less obvious aggrandizement. The aggrandizement as an overcompensation, is there, but the lifelong nature of these issues of character have provided enough time to become accustomed to maintaining some semblances of functional balance. However, the trickster as a function cannot be mastered, only collaborated with to self-regulate. Hence, those who think they are its master will always be betrayed by it. The traditional Jungian shadow is a fiction. It is contra naturam for an evolutionary system to develop a negative internal opposite in the manner of a Mr. Hyde to the Dr. Jekyll of the ego. A compensatory opposite, an alter ego, dynamically polarized for self-regulation, makes both evolutionary and empirical sense. That it is separate to the moral complex system, or Freud's superego, also makes sense, as the alter ego is not a moral function, only an adaptive compensation. Jung's model of the ego and shadow is essentially neurotic in its polarity, and reflects the kind of division that occurs when instinct and drive are repressed inappropriately. The trickster, however, is far better represented transculturally and across history than Jung's shadow. This is because it is a natural dynamic, whose purpose is in service of psychological and psychosocial homeostasis. The psyche, Jung correctly observed, is a self-regulating system. Biological homeostasis acts within preset tolerances of health and adaptive response. It acts quickly under most conditions, excluding disease. Psychological homeostasis is slower to compensate, as it has to regulate complex internal psychological and external psychosocial relationships and interactions over extended periods of time, including whole of lifespan development. Hence, the psychological self-regulating function acts and presents as it must, including as the trickster function. The king is not an archetype. Instead, he is an analogue of the ego as the executive function of the state. The role of the trickster as court jester is a direct analogue to the role of the trickster within the individual personality. Kings have to be crowned by confirmation of due process and the acceptance of the people. The ego has to emerge by consent of the genome. If the king were an archetype, there would be no confirmation necessary, as it would be separate to the conscious executive role of the ego within the psyche, and be part of the greater regulatory system. The king would, in effect, be Jung's self-archetype, which would mean that the ego was Jung's self, with a capital S, which it is not. The trickster could not override Jung's self-archetype, but it can override the ego. It is not the function of the trickster to communicate with the self, but with the ego. Kings can be dethroned, abdicate, killed in battle, etc. None of that applies to Jung's construct of the self. All apply, however, to the ego. We really hope that you have enjoyed this video and found its contents useful in bringing some real-world clarity to the purpose and manifestations of the trickster function. If you have, please could you consider leaving a like and a comment? It really helps the channel reach more people. Thanks everyone, take care, and we'll speak again soon.